Architecture is an expression of the culture we live in and the cultures that our predecessors have lived in. The newspapers are the flimsiest, most ephemeral of media. You know, they're here today, they're gone tomorrow. Architecture is the most permanent and the slowest by far of all the media. In a way, the newspapers wanted to compensate for the ephemerality of their product and to build a kind of presence into the city. It was a very interesting moment when around the world the newspapers started building for themselves, because it came roughly in between the First and the Second World Wars in the 1920s and 1930s, and that was when virtually every household bought a newspaper. It's never been like that before, never been like that since. For that brief moment, the newspapers had a sense of association. They felt like they expressed the nature of the city. Fleet Street has become synonymous with the newspaper industry. So when we talk about newspapers, we talk about Fleet Street, and their printing presses were here as well. The underground was a whole subterranean world in which the newspapers emerged late at night. One of the finest newspaper buildings in Fleet Street is at number 85, and it's the former home of the Press Association and Reuters. It was built in 1935 by Sir Edwin Lutchens, who was the architecture of the establishment. At the same time as he was designing this building here, he was designing the government buildings in New Delhi, and he just finished building the war memorials across continental Europe to the massacres of the First World War. He had a very particular, somber, quite classical style. This is a good example of that. It's a kind of architecture of empire, the way a British industry might like to see itself. Dignified, authoritative, urbane, modern enough, so clearly not 19th century, not Victorian, a little bit stripped down, a little bit kind of functional, but very elegant. It has this tripartite structure, so it's in three parts. It has a base, which is rusticated with this kind of rough-looking stonework, and it has a central section, and then it has a more delicate top with curves and a more feminine, sculpted attic. What we think of as classicism tends to have columns and porticos. So if we look at Somerset House, which is nearby, you can see classical Roman columns, the domes, the kind of huge courtyard. But you also see some elements like rustication, which is the kind of rough stonework you see on the first floor of the building, which reappear in the Lutchens Building. This is a restrained classicism with the details stripped down. It's the British reassessing themselves after the massacres of the First World War and being a little more modest and trying to make a dignified presence in the city. The Telegraph has always been a conservative newspaper. It's been solid, kind of middle class. And you would expect it then to build itself a classic or conservative building. Actually, when you look at it, it's a dazzling piece of Art Deco. It was built in 1927, and the architects were Elcock and Sutcliffe and Burnett and Tate. They were the architects of their era. The front of the Telegraph Building is a composite. It's part classical, part Art Deco. You see over the front door there are these two kind of stylized figures of two Mercuries delivering extremely fast the newsprint that needs to kind of go to every corner of the country. It has that sense of a dependable classical architecture that we saw in Lutchens, but it has a completely different glamour applied to it. Art Deco was the architecture that emerged between the wars in the 1920s. It was the architecture of the movie industry, of the big musicals of the 1930s. So this idea of a kind of glamorous Hollywood architecture was very much in the air. And the Telegraph succumbed. The dynamism of the industry, an industry that sees itself in a way as cool and as responsive and as glamorous as the movies, is embodied in its architecture.
Life's great, life's fun, for your mother, lucky one, how things are coming my
At number 120, we have, I think, one of the most intriguing and elegant interwar buildings in the city, the headquarters of the Daily Express from 1932. This marked a real change in architecture, and what was so radical about it was that there was none of the classical detail, there was none of the columns, none of the stonework. This was an absolutely kind of stripped back to the minimum building. The Daily Express building was commissioned by Lord Beaverbrook, who was busy building the Daily Express into the biggest mass circulation newspaper in the world. Ellison Clark, the architect, worked with an engineer called Owen Williams, and he welcomed the opportunity to make something very new here, using a material called vitrolite, which was glass that's black all the way through. So it looks a little like a marble, but it can do things that marble can't. It can cut very thin, can curve around corners, and it was also the first curtain-walled building in the city. And what that means is that the structure was set behind the facade, and the facade is just a skin of glass laid around the edge, like a curtain drawn around the edge of the building. And the corners are, in a way, a bit of an echo of the very glamorous transatlantic liners that were the kind of zenith of avant-garde luxury in the 1930s. When you go inside, the modernism kind of dissipates a bit, and we're back to the Art Deco, another one of these incredibly glamorous movie palace type Art Deco interiors, with colour, with dripping ceilings and geometric patterns. So I think it was a kind of jewel box effect. I think you could argue that the 1920s and 30s, when these buildings were built, was a kind of golden age of the newspapers. The buildings are still here, but the newspapers aren't. Newspapers began to move out in the 80s, and extraordinarily, within about a decade, they were all gone. They were built to embody an era, to embody a set of values that the newspapers believed they exuded, of practicality, dignity, a lasting feel of elegance. Elegance lasts.